3,000 ships are already hitting the coast, and they aren't here for gold. The great boar is dead in a pit of vipers, and his sons have just made a vow that will turn all of England into a graveyard. You've heard of Viking raids, but you've never seen a war of total annihilation led by a monster they call the Boneless. They are not just coming to kill the king, they are coming to turn his living body into a ritual so gruesome that history tried to erase its name. The drums are beating, the axes are sharpened, and the sky is turning black with ravens. This isn't a battle. It's the beginning of the most terrifying revenge plot in human history. The air in Northumbria did not smell of salt. It smelled of damp earth and the copper tang of fresh blood. King Ælla stood at the edge of the stone pit, his shadow stretching over the man chained below. "You died the moment you touched my shores, Ragnar," the king spat. Below him, Ragnar Lothbrok, the man who made Paris tremble, looked up. His face was a mask of filth, yet his eyes burned with terrifying blue fire. With a dry, wheezing laugh, Ragnar uttered his final prophecy. How the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. Then Ælla gave the signal. The wooden grate slid back, and the pit came alive with the rhythmic rattling of 100 vipers. The first strike hit Ragnar's neck. He didn't scream. He roared a defiant invitation to Valhalla until the venom turned his blood to sludge. Ragnar Lothbrok was dead. Now, as his body grew cold, a heat was igniting across the North Sea that would burn England to its foundations. In the great hall of Kattegat, the air was thick with smoke. Bjorn Ironside, the eldest son, sat by the hearth, honing a blade that had tasted the blood of 20 nations. He was a mountain of muscle and scars. Beside him, Sigurd Snake in the Eye played with bone dice. The doors burst open. A messenger, drenched in sea spray, stumbled toward the high seat. He carried a small leather pouch, the seal of Northumbria. "He is gone," the messenger whispered. "The king of the north is dead, in a pit of snakes, by the hand of Ælla." The silence was more deafening than any battle cry. Bjorn did not move, but the whetstone in his hand snapped in two. His knuckles turned white as polished bone. He didn't weep. Vikings of his blood had reservoirs of rage instead of tears. But the most terrifying reaction came from the corner, where the youngest brother sat in the shadows. Ivar the Boneless did not stand. His legs were twisted, useless limbs, but as the news settled, his eyes turned a shade of blue so bright it looked supernatural. He gripped a silver goblet so hard the metal deformed, red wine spilling over his fingers like royal blood. "Snakes?" Ivar's voice was a low, melodic hiss. "He gave a lion to the snakes? The great boar has fallen," Bjorn growled, finally standing. "And now the piggies must grunt. Tonight we do not feast for Ragnar. Tonight we prepare a feast for the crows of England." The call went out that night. It wasn't a call for a raid. It was a summons for the Great Heathen Army. For centuries the Norse had attacked in small groups, hit and run. But Ivar saw a different path. He didn't want gold. He wanted the soil of England soaked so deeply in blood that nothing but Norse grain would ever grow there again. He wanted a war of annihilation. Within days, the fjords filled with 500 ships. Longships arrived from the freezing coasts of Norway and the forests of Sweden. These were the berserkers and the shield maidens who dreamed of a war this grand. The banners of the Raven were raised, thousands of them fluttering in the biting wind. Every blacksmith was forging spearheads. Every woman was weaving sails. Ivar oversaw the preparations from a high platform. He knew brute force wouldn't break the 4 English kingdoms alone. He needed to be the wedge that split them. He spent hours over maps, his fingers tracing the rivers that led like veins to the heart of Saxon power. "They expect us to land in Northumbria," Ivar said to Bjorn. "They expect us to rush blindly to the pit where our father died. But Ælla is waiting there. He thinks he knows us. We have the numbers to crush him," Bjorn countered. "Why wait?" "Because I don't want to just kill him, brother," Ivar replied, a cruel smile curling his lips. "I want to dismantle his world. We will land in East Anglia. We will take their horses. We will move faster than their messengers. By the time Ælla realizes the storm has arrived, we will already be behind his walls." The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented. The sagas would say the sea disappeared beneath the hulls of 1,000 ships. This was the largest gathering of Vikings in history. As the final ship was loaded, the sons of Ragnar gathered for a blood sacrifice. A great white bull was brought before them. With one stroke, Bjorn opened its throat. They painted the prows of their ships with the warm gore, a gift to Odin for a bloody harvest. "To England!" Bjorn roared, raising his blood-stained axe. "To vengeance!" the army screamed back, a wall of sound that shook the mountains. As the fleet pushed off, the sight was terrifying. Hundreds of dragon-headed ships carved through the waves. At the front was Ivar's ship. He sat in the prow, strapped into a high wooden chair. He looked like a vengeful god. Behind him, his brothers, Bjorn, Sigurd, Ubba, and Hvitserk, led their own divisions. They were the 5 fingers of a fist closing around the throat of Britain. Back in Northumbria, King Ælla sat in his hall in York, drinking from a golden chalice. He had killed the boar. He felt invincible. He listened to the wind, thinking it was merely a storm. He had no idea the wind carried the scent of smoke and the beat of 1,000 oars. He had no idea the piggies were coming to tear his kingdom apart, piece by piece. The crossing was brutal. The North Sea tried to swallow them, tossing ships like toys. One ship was lost to a rogue wave, its crew disappearing into the abyss, but the rest pushed on, fueled by a collective psychosis of revenge. Every man had a story of Ragnar. To them, he was the soul of the North, and Ælla had extinguished that soul in a cowardly pit. On the dawn of the 7th day, the mist lifted off the coast of East Anglia. A lone Saxon lookout stood on a watchtower. At first he saw a line of clouds, then a forest of dead trees rising from the water. It took him 60 seconds to realize what he saw. It wasn't clouds. It was a forest of masts. It was an armada that stretched from north to south as far as the eye could see. The lookout didn't sound his horn. He fell to his knees. The stories were true. The sons of the dragon had come home. Ivar watched the coastline draw near. He saw the thatched roofs and the panicked movement of people. He felt a surge of cold joy. The hook was set. They had arrived undetected, a massive shadow falling over an unsuspecting land. "Land the ships," Ivar commanded, "and bring me my chariot. I want to be the first to touch the soil they think is theirs." As the keels ground into the shingle, the Great Heathen Army poured out like a dark tide. The invasion of England had begun, and the world would never be the same. The English soil felt soft beneath the Viking boots, but it was a trap of false peace. East Anglia was a land of rich monasteries and fat livestock, totally unprepared for a professional army. Ivar the Boneless was lowered from his ship into a custom-built chariot, his eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't order his men to burn the villages. Not yet. He needed something more valuable than gold. Speed. "Every horse in this kingdom belongs to us," Ivar commanded, his voice cold and sharp. "If a Saxon resists, take his head. If he yields, take his stable." Within 48 hours, the Great Heathen Army had transformed. The Vikings, traditionally masters of the sea, were now a terrifying mounted force. They didn't ride like knights, they rode like demons, moving 40 miles a day across the Roman roads. The king of East Anglia, Edmund, watched in horror from his high windows as his kingdom was stripped bare. He tried to negotiate, offering silver to make them leave. Ivar took the silver, then took the horses anyway. The Norsemen were not here for a bribe, they were here for a map. While the Vikings consolidated their strength, King Ælla of Northumbria remained in York, blinded by his own arrogance. He believed the Vikings were still looting the southern coast. He didn't know that Ivar had already mapped every river and road leading to his gates. The Great Heathen Army wasn't a mob, it was a precision instrument. "We move on York tonight," Ivar announced to his brothers. "The Saxons celebrate their holy day. They think the winter protects them. We will show them that the north wind brings death." The march was a masterpiece of silent terror. 5,000 warriors moved through the fog, their weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent the clinking of steel. They avoided the main gates, instead targeting the crumbling sections of the old Roman walls that Ælla had neglected to repair. The Vikings arrived at the outskirts of York at 3 a.m. The city was asleep, dreaming of peace, while the sons of Ragnar stood in the shadows like wolves at a sheepfold. Bjorn Ironside led the first wave. He didn't use a battering ram. He used the arrogance of the guards. A small team of Vikings scaled the walls using iron hooks, silently slitting the throats of the sentries before they could sound a horn. The heavy oak gates groaned open from the inside. "Now!" Bjorn roared, his voice shattering the silence of the night. The Vikings poured into the streets of York like a black flood. The city woke up to the sound of splintering wood and the terrifying war cries of the north. Saxon men stumbled out of their homes in their tunics, clutching rusted farm tools, only to be met by the polished axes of the berserkers. The street became a slaughterhouse. The smell of wood smoke and fresh blood filled the narrow alleys. Ivar watched the chaos from his chariot at the center of the city square. He wasn't fighting, he was orchestrating. He pointed his sword toward the royal palace, where Ælla's elite guard was trying to form a shield wall. "Break them!" Ivar screamed. The Viking shield wall crashed into the Saxons with the force of a tidal wave. Shields shattered, spears snapped like dry twigs. The Saxon third, mostly farmers and tradesmen, broke and ran in the face of the Norse veterans. But there was no escape. Ivar had blocked every exit. He wanted every soldier in York to feel the terror his father felt in the pit. As the sun began to rise, the eternal city of the north was a graveyard. Fires raged in the merchant quarter, and the gutters ran red. But the ultimate prize was missing. Bjorn kicked down the doors of the royal bedchamber, only to find it empty. "He is gone!" Bjorn shouted, his face splattered with gore. "The coward fled through the secret tunnels." King Ælla had escaped to the countryside, abandoning his people to the blades of the Northmen. He was heading north to meet his rival, Osbert. For years, the two kings had fought a civil war for the throne of Northumbria. Now, faced with a common nightmare, they were forced to join forces. "Let him run," Ivar said, a dark grin spreading across his face. "Let him gather every man he has. I don't want to hunt him in the woods. I want him to lead his entire army into my trap. I want to destroy the crown of Northumbria in a single day." The Vikings spent the next weeks turning York into a fortress. They repaired the Roman walls and stockpiled grain. Ivar knew that a cornered king would eventually return. He wanted Ælla to see his own capital turned against him. The tension in the Viking camp was electric. Every man knew the big battle was coming. They spent their days sharpening axes and tattooing their skin with runes of victory. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were an occupying force. They had taken the second greatest city in England in a single night, with almost no losses. On the 21st day, the scouts returned. "They are coming," the scout reported. "Ælla and Osbert have combined their forces, 8,000 men. They are 5 miles out." Ivar looked at his brothers. The moment of truth had arrived. The Saxon kings were bringing their entire world to the gates of York, believing they could take it back. They didn't realize that Ivar had already decided how they would die. "Close the gates," Ivar commanded, "but leave the breach in the north wall open. I want them to think they've found a way in. I want them to rush into the mouth of the beast." The Saxon army appeared on the horizon, a sea of white crosses and iron helmets. At the head of the army rode King Ælla, his golden armor shining in the winter sun. He looked at his city and saw the raven banners flying from the towers. His rage blinded him to the trap. He ordered the charge immediately, a massive wave of infantry rushing toward the broken north wall. As the Saxons funneled into the narrow breach, Ivar signaled the hidden archers. A rain of 1,000 arrows fell from the rooftops, turning the breach into a bottleneck of corpses. The Saxons were trapped, pushed from behind by their own men and slaughtered from above. "The trap is closed," Ivar shouted. Suddenly the Viking gates swung open, and Bjorn Ironside led a heavy cavalry charge into the Saxon flank. The impact was like a hammer hitting glass. The Saxon line disintegrated. In the middle of the carnage, King Osbert fell, his head taken by a single swing of a Viking axe. King Ælla saw his army dying around him. He turned to flee once more, but this time there were no tunnels. A massive Viking warrior, Ubba, tackled the king from his horse, pinning him to the muddy earth. The battle was over. The Saxon army was decimated, and King Ælla, the man who killed Ragnar Lothbrok, was finally in the hands of the sons he had mocked. Ivar crawled from his chariot toward the trembling king. He leaned in close, his blue eyes reflecting the burning city. Do you remember the snakes, Ælla? Ivar whispered. They told me you like to watch things suffer. Now, it's my turn to watch. The silence that followed the Battle of York was heavier than the roar of the fight. The Great Heathen Army stood amidst a landscape of corpses, their breathing heavy in the freezing air. At the center of the carnage lay King Ælla, pinned to the frozen mud by the weight of Viking spears. He was no longer the proud monarch who had mocked Ragnar from the edge of a pit. He was a broken man, his golden armor caked in the filth of defeat. Bring him. Ivar's voice sliced through the cold. The Vikings dragged Ælla through the streets of his own capital. The citizens of York watched from behind shattered shutters as their king was hauled like a carcass toward the central square. Ivar sat in his chariot, watching Ælla with a terrifying detached curiosity. To Ivar, this wasn't just a prisoner. This was the final piece of a grand mechanical puzzle. Inside the Great Hall of York, the atmosphere was electric with a dark, vengeful energy. Bjorn Ironside stood by the hearth, the blood on his axe slowly drying into a dark crust. He looked at his brothers, Sigurd, Ubba, and Fitzurk. They were the victors, but the shadow of their father's death still loomed over them. The Saxon army is broken, Bjorn stated, his voice echoing off the stone walls. We hold the north. We should finish this quickly and secure the borders. Wessex is already gathering its strength. Finish it quickly? Ivar turned his head, his eyes glowing with that supernatural blue. You want to give him a soldier's death, Bjorn? A quick stroke of the blade? After what he did? He is a king, Bjorn countered, his brow furrowed. We have won. There is no honor in lingering over a fallen foe. Honor? Ivar laughed, a sharp, jarring sound. Honor died in the pit with our father. This is not about honor, brother. This is about memory. If we kill him quickly, the Saxons will forget us in a generation. But if we make his death a legend, they will tremble at the name of Ragnar for 1,000 years. The tension between the brothers was a physical weight. Bjorn represented the old way, the path of the warrior and the explorer. Ivar represented something new and far more dangerous, a path of psychological terror and total dominance. The other brothers remained silent, caught between Bjorn's logic and Ivar's burning charisma. Outside, the Viking army was beginning to celebrate. Casks of Saxon ale were hauled into the streets, and fires were lit using the timbers of broken homes. But amidst the revelry, there was a gruesome task at hand. Ivar ordered his men to construct a wooden frame on a high hill overlooking the city, a place where every soul in Northumbria could see what happened next. What is that for? Sigurd asked, pointing at the structure. The Blood Eagle, Ivar whispered. The hall went silent. Even the most hardened veterans among them felt a chill. The Blood Eagle was more than an execution. It was a ritual of such extreme brutality that many believed it was merely a myth designed to scare children. It was a sacrifice to Odin, a way to send a message to the gods themselves. As the sun began to set, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, King Ælla was brought to the hill. He was stripped to the waist, his skin pale and shivering in the wind. He looked at the wooden frame and then at Ivar, who was being carried up the slope on a shield. You are a monster, Ælla hissed, his voice cracking. I am the son of the man you murdered, Ivar replied, leaning in so close their noses almost touched. I am the consequence of your arrogance. You thought you could kill a legend and walk away. Tonight, I will turn you into a monument. Ivar turned to the assembled army. Thousands of Vikings stood in a massive circle, their torches flickering like a sea of orange stars. The air was still. Not a single man spoke. Men of the North, Ivar shouted. Our father died in the dark, surrounded by snakes. He had no one to witness his courage. But this king will have the entire world as his witness. He will show us how a Saxon dies. The ritual began with the beating of drums, a slow, rhythmic thud that matched the heartbeat of the nervous king. Ivar took a specialized knife, its blade curved like a bird's beak. He didn't rush. He wanted every second to feel like an eternity for Ælla. Bjorn stepped forward, his hand on Ivar's shoulder. Ivar, this is enough. The men have seen his humiliation. Ivar didn't even look at him. He shook off Bjorn's hand and made the first incision, a sharp, horizontal cut across the king's lower back. Ælla let out a scream that seemed to tear the very air. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that would haunt the dreams of every man present for the rest of their lives. But Ivar was just beginning. Each step of the ritual was performed with surgical precision. The tension in the crowd was so thick it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Every few minutes, Ivar would pause, allowing the king to gasp for air, ensuring he remained conscious for the entirety of the process. The brothers watched in a mixture of awe and horror. They had seen death in 100 forms, on the battlefield, in the waves, in the sickness of winter, but they had never seen a human being dismantled with such cold, calculated intent. It was at this moment that Bjorn realized his brother was no longer just a man. Ivar had become the personification of the North's collective rage. As the moon reached its zenith, the ritual reached its peak. The physical scale of the horror was immense. Ivar worked with the focus of an artist, his hands stained to the elbows in royal blood. He was no longer a cripple. In this moment, he was the most powerful man on earth. "Look at him!" Ivar screamed to the heavens. "Look at the King of Northumbria!" The final act of the ritual was prepared. The Vikings began to chant, a low, guttural drone that vibrated in the chests of everyone on the hill. The piggies were no longer grunting. They were howling for blood. The part 3 ends with the image of Ælla's silhouette against the moon, the ritual almost complete, and the realization among the brothers that, after tonight, there is no turning back. They have not just killed the king, they have declared war on the very idea of mercy. The drums stopped. The only sound on the hill was the whistling of the wind through the ribcage of the dying king. Ivar the Boneless stood over his work, his face splattered with blood, his eyes glowing with a manic, icy triumph. He had done it. He had performed the blood eagle. King Ælla's back had been opened, his ribs severed from his spine and pulled outward like the wings of a great bird of prey. His lungs had been pulled through the openings, fluttering with every agonizing, shallow gasp he took. "Behold!" Ivar roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "The Raven of the North has landed!" The Viking army erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a primal, rhythmic howling that shook the very foundations of York. They struck their shields with their spears, a wall of iron sound that echoed for miles. To the Vikings, this wasn't just a murder, it was a holy act. They had turned their father's killer into a literal sacrifice to Odin. King Ælla's eyes remained open for 60 seconds of pure, unshielded horror before the light finally flickered out. He died not as a martyr, but as a scream frozen in the cold air. His body was left on the frame, a grisly monument that could be seen from the walls of the city below. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new tension settled over the sons of Ragnar. Bjorn Ironside looked at the mangled remains of the king and then at his brother. He saw the way the men looked at Ivar, not with the respect given to a general, but with the fear given to a demon. "The debt is paid," Bjorn said, his voice low and heavy. "The blood of our father is washed away. We must go now. The King of Wessex, Alfred, is already fortifying the south. If we stay here celebrating a corpse, we will be surrounded." Ivar turned to Bjorn, a slow, dark smile spreading across his lips. "Go. You want to leave now, when the Saxons are paralyzed by terror. Now is the time to strike. We have broken the north. We should march until the sea stops us." "We came for revenge, Ivar, not to rule a graveyard," Bjorn snapped, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. "The Great Heathen Army is a tool for justice, not a toy for your madness." The brothers stood on the blood-soaked hill, divided by two different visions of the future. While they argued, the news of the Blood Eagle was already spreading across England like a plague. Messengers who had witnessed the ritual fled into the night, their faces white with shock. They told stories of the Boneless One, who could dismantle a man while he still breathed. In the kingdom of Wessex, the young Prince Alfred sat in his study, listening to the reports. He didn't panic. He took a quill and wrote a single word on a map of England: unstoppable. He realized that the Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were a force of nature that had abandoned all human limits. The execution of Ælla hadn't just ended a blood feud. It had unified the remaining English kingdoms in a state of absolute existential terror. Back in York, the Vikings began to realize the consequence of their act. The local Saxons, who might have surrendered to a normal conqueror, now fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose. Every village became a fortress. Every farmer became a sniper with a bow. The piggies weren't just grunting. They were biting back with a ferocity the Vikings hadn't expected. "They don't fear us anymore, Ivar," Sigurd Snake in the Eye noted, looking at the burning horizon. "They hate us. There is a difference." "Hate is just fear in a different mask," Ivar dismissed him. "We will burn enough villages until the hate turns back to silence." But the cracks in the Great Heathen Army were widening. Bjorn wanted to sail to the Mediterranean, to explore the legendary lands of gold and sun. He felt the mission in England was finished. Ivar, however, was obsessed with the total conquest of the island. He began to recruit the most brutal elements of the army, the men who enjoyed the meat work of the invasion, forming a cult of personality around himself. The scale of the war was changing. It was no longer about the death of one man. It was about the survival of a culture. As the winter deepened, the Vikings found themselves trapped in a hostile land, surrounded by a population that wanted them dead. The food supplies were running low, and the horses they had captured were dying in the cold. "We need a victory," Ubba said, looking at the maps. "A real victory, not a ritual. Alfred is moving his army toward the border of Mercia. If he joins with the remnants of the Northumbrian rebels, we will be caught in a pincer." Ivar didn't listen to his brothers. He spent his nights sitting at the foot of the frame where Ælla's body still hung, talking to the shadows. He was planning something even more ambitious, something that would require the sacrifice of more than just a king. The part 4 ends with a shot of the Great Heathen Army splitting into 2 columns. Bjorn and half the fleet prepare to leave for the south, while Ivar and the core of the fanatics prepare to march into the heart of the Saxon wilderness. The brotherhood that had crossed the sea to avenge Ragnar was now broken, and the real war for England was about to take a darker, more desperate turn. The brotherhood was officially fractured. Bjorn Ironside's ships had vanished into the morning mist, heading for the riches of the Mediterranean, leaving Ivar the Boneless as the undisputed commander of the remaining 3,000 fanatics. Ivar didn't care for his brother's weakness. He wanted a kingdom of bone and ash. He turned his eyes toward the south, toward the kingdom of Mercia, where the last great Saxon armies were gathering. "We do not march on the roads," Ivar commanded, his voice a rasping whisper. "The Saxons expect a wall of shields. We will give them a ghost." Ivar led his army into the Great Fens, a massive labyrinthine territory of freezing swamps and toxic bogs. It was a place where horses drowned and heavy armor became a death sentence. The Vikings stripped to their leather tunics, painting their faces with black mud. They moved like predators through the reeds, disappearing for weeks at a time. The Saxon scouts, sent to find them, never returned. Their bodies were later found pinned to trees, their chests carved with the sign of the raven. Inside the swamp, the atmosphere was suffocating. The Great Heathen Army was becoming something monstrous. Starvation began to set in, but Ivar used it to fuel their fanaticism. He told them that Odin demanded their hunger, that their suffering was a bridge to Valhalla. They ate raw fish and swamp moss, driven by Ivar's terrifying blue gaze. He sat in his chariot, which was now modified with wide, flat wheels for the mud, looking like a skeletal god of the mire. "They are waiting for us at the Repton Bridge," Ubba reported, his face gaunt. 8,000 Saxons under King Burgred. They have fortified the high ground. If we attack now, we will be slaughtered. "We aren't attacking the bridge, Ubba," Ivar replied, tracing a line through the muck. "We are going underneath them." Ivar had discovered a series of ancient, forgotten Roman tunnels that ran beneath the marshlands. While the Saxon army stood on the dry ground of Repton, confident that no army could cross the surrounding bogs, the Vikings were crawling through the dark subterranean veins of the earth. For 3 days, 3,000 men moved in total darkness, breathing air that smelled of ancient rot. The tension reached a breaking point when the tunnels began to flood. The water rose to their chests, freezing, stagnant, and filled with leeches. Some men panicked, their screams echoing in the stone pipes. Ivar, being carried in a litter above the water, didn't flinch. He drew his sword and struck the stone ceiling. "Silence!" he hissed. "The gods are testing your resolve. Do you want to die like rats, or do you want to rise like giants?" On the night of the 4th day, the Vikings emerged. They didn't come from the forest or the road. They erupted from the very floors of the Saxon camp. In the middle of the night, the earth seemed to vomit forth thousands of mud-caked demons. The Saxons, caught in their tents, didn't even have time to reach for their spears. The massacre of Repton was the most concentrated burst of violence in the entire invasion. There was no shield wall, no honor, no strategy, only 60 minutes of pure, chaotic butchery. Ivar's men moved with a frantic, starvation-driven energy, cutting through the Saxon camp like a scythe through dry grass. King Burgred was captured in his silk nightshirt, trembling as he realized the ghosts had finally arrived. But the victory came at a massive cost. Ubba, Ivar's own brother, was struck by a stray Saxon axe during the chaos. As the sun rose over the blood-stained swamp, Ivar found his brother slumped against a Roman pillar, his life spilling out into the mud. "Was it worth it, Ivar?" Ubba gasped, his eyes fading. "The blood, the madness. Look at us." Ivar didn't answer. He watched his brother die with a face of stone. He was now truly alone, the last son of Ragnar left in England with the power to finish the job. He didn't mourn. He took Ubba's blood and smeared it across his own forehead, a final vow of total annihilation. The news of Repton broke the spirit of Mercia. King Burgred was sent into exile, and Ivar installed a puppet king to do his bidding. But the Great Heathen Army was now a skeleton of its former self. Out of the 10,000 who had crossed the sea, only a few thousand remained. They were tired, wounded, and deep in enemy territory. "One more kingdom," Ivar whispered to the cold wind. "Wessex, Alfred, the head of the snake." The part 5 ends with Ivar standing at the edge of the marshes, looking south toward the last bastion of English resistance. Behind him, his army is a collection of hollowed-eyed ghosts, their armor rusted and their spirits twisted. He has conquered the north and the Midlands, but the final, most dangerous battle is yet to come. The piggies have been slaughtered, but the smartest of them all, Alfred, is waiting in the shadows with a trap of his own. The march toward Wessex was a journey through a frozen graveyard. Ivar the Boneless was no longer just a general. He was a walking myth, a skeletal figure, draped in furs and the dried blood of kings. Behind him trailed the remnants of the Great Heathen Army, men who had forgotten the faces of their wives but remembered every word of Ivar's dark promises. They reached the borders of Eddington, where the young King Alfred waited. This was not the Saxon army Ivar had faced before. Alfred had spent months studying Viking tactics. He didn't hide in a fortress. He built a wall of shields so deep and so disciplined that it looked like a cliff of iron. "They think their crosses will save them," Ivar hissed, his chariot vibrating as he was pulled to the front of the line. "Show them that Odin is the only god who answers in blood." The battle began with a roar that seemed to split the sky. The Vikings charged with the desperation of men who had nowhere left to run. They hit the Saxon shield wall like a hammer, but the wall did not break. Alfred had trained his men to rotate, fresh soldiers replacing the tired ones every 10 minutes. For hours, the two forces ground against each other in a rhythmic, mechanical slaughter. Ivar realized the momentum was shifting. He ordered his personal guard, the most fanatical berserkers, to create a wedge. He threw himself into the center of the fray, his chariot becoming a platform of death as he swung his twin axes from his seated position. For a moment, it looked like the Vikings would break through. Ivar locked eyes with Alfred across the field, the scholar versus the monster. But then the trap snapped shut. From the tree line on the Viking flanks, 1,000 hidden Saxon riders erupted. They hadn't been part of the shield wall. They were the reserve Alfred had hidden for this exact moment. The Viking line was crushed from 3 sides. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. "Brother, we must retreat!" Vitzerk, the last surviving brother by Ivar's side, screamed over the din. "I do not retreat," Ivar roared, his eyes turning a blinding electric blue. "I am the son of Ragnar. I am the Blood Eagle." He fought like a whirlwind, his axes shearing through limbs and shields, but he was drowning in a sea of Saxon steel. A spear pierced his shoulder, then another hit his thigh. His chariot was overturned, spilling him into the freezing mud. Around him, his legendary army was being dismantled man by man. The piggies hadn't just grunted, they had evolved into wolves. In the final moments of the chaos, as the Saxon sun began to set, Ivar lay on his back, looking up at the grey sky. Alfred stood over him, his sword pointed at Ivar's throat. The King of Wessex didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted and sorrowful. "It is over, Ivar," Alfred whispered. "Your father's ghost is satisfied. There is no more blood left to take." Ivar didn't beg. He didn't even flinch. He let out a wet, rattling laugh, his mouth filling with red foam. "You think you won, Saxon? Look at your land. Every field is a grave. Every river is poisoned. I didn't come to rule you. I came to break you, and you will never be the same." With a sudden violent movement, Ivar lunged forward, not to kill Alfred, but to force the king's blade into his own heart. He chose his final moment, dying on his own terms, a terrifying smile frozen on his face. Culmination. The Great Heathen Army was shattered. Some fled back to the ships, others stayed to farm the lands they had conquered, eventually becoming the very people they once hated. But the legend of the Blood Eagle lived on. For centuries, mothers in England would quiet their children by whispering the name of the Boneless One. The story ends with a shot of the desolate pit in Northumbria where Ragnar died, now covered in snow. A single raven lands on the edge, looking toward the south. The sons of Ragnar had their revenge, but in the end, the price of the great boar's legacy was the total destruction of the world he loved. The era of the Vikings in England had reached its bloodiest peak, and the fire they started would burn for 300 years.